our guest today is somebody that we have seen before, Doc Wiginton, the Quilt Doc. He's with us. We're glad to have you with us.
Hey, Tony.
Um, well, Doc, last time you were here on the podcast, you had just received the delivery of your second Ascend. And I guess we'll just start out with why did you choose to get an Ascend in the first place? And how has that decision affected your business?
Well, thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Glad to have you.
Um, I tell folks that choosing the Ascend is sort of like finding your favorite cottage cheese or your favorite ice cream. Like once you found it, you can't go back. You can't go back to anything else.
Mm,
It's too good, right? And so you're always wanting that little bit more accuracy, that little bit more speed. And so
mm.
I tried to talk myself into a Statler, which is an awesome machine. But at the end of the day, I knew I just wouldn't be happy unless I had the Ascend. And I was using the Ascend I really wanted it for my custom work. The new machine was for my custom work, for most of my custom pieces. My old machine is a 30-inch Ascend and my Ascend upgrade, and my second machine is a 26-inch Ascend. So the 26 would help me to get closer, and so that's what I wanted for my custom stuff. And I tell you, it's done the trick. I can keep the edge to edge running on my 30 and not have to slow down or not have to feel bad about taking longer on a custom piece. And that's been great. My customers love that. They used to have to drop off a quilt, excuse me, drop off a quilt, a custom quilt, and then wait until I finished all the edge to edge I had piled up until it was the turn to do the next custom quilt. And of course, theirs might not be the next one. And then the edge to edge stuff, my edge to edge customers, wanted it quickly and they might have to wait until I finish this custom. So it was always that tension in my studio. And having the two machines has really solved that. It's made my customers a lot happier and I am able to do more quilts now. So that's been really great.
I have a couple questions brimming, and it's hard to know which one to ask first, but I'm going to go with this one. For people that have never operated two machines at the same time before, which most people have not,
Right.
can you give them an idea as to, okay, you've loaded up both quilts and you started the edge to edge. Tell me about how often it breaks into your creative flow on that custom to where you need to turn your back on it and pay attention to can you kind of give people an idea how that rhythm is?
Sure. So I set up my studio so that on my edge-to-edge machine, my computer is on the right side, and on my custom machine, the computer's on the left side. So I'm pretty close to both of the control surfaces within 3 or 4 feet. And they're both, how do I say this? They're sort of both open to me. So I don't have to walk
Mhm.
around any of the machines to get to them. They're both within my eyesight at the same time. So if there's a problem, I can stop it pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
I'm imagining something kind of like a galley style kitchen where you have basically a runway down the middle and
That would be ideal. Mine's more like a V, just because of how my space is.
okay,
But
all right.
same kind of idea. That open that galley up a little bit.
Okay.
And it works out pretty slick. There's some tricks I learned right away to help make it better. Sewing backs together on the edge to edge so I can do more than one quilt without having to stop and load a quilt. I can stay in the creative zone to change a bobbin, especially if I've got a bunch of them ready to go. And I choose my quilting patterns so that I can go all the way down, come all the way back. I can really take advantage of all 30 inches of my space.
Hmm.
So that gives me more time. But of course, you run out of bobbin thread. Sometimes, things happen, you make mistakes. But for the most part, as long as I've got it loaded up well and I've got bobbins ready to go, um, it's not too bad. It's not too bad at all. It does keep you moving. Your legs don't get sore from sitting too long. Um, and of course, the custom quilts, those, I might work on one pass or one chunk for a long time. And so once it's loaded sometimes in my studio for a couple weeks or better. So that's not so bad because, the real tough mornings are when I have to load a custom and all the edge to edge. Then it's sort of hard to get going. I haven't cracked that nut yet, but for the most part, it's worth the little extra effort of prep to stay in it.
So it sounds like you do a fair amount of both custom and the edge to edge.
Yep.
Do you how much custom do you do?
Well, there's not very many folks around me who do custom. It's expensive and it takes a long time. And there's just not very many people who do it. And that's one of the reasons I started long arming was because I had a lot of friends and students who wanted custom quilting but couldn't find it. It wasn't that they couldn't afford it. They just couldn't find somebody to do it. And there's a lot of folks out there who have long arms who only do edge to edge. And that's pretty much how my market is. So when I started, I knew I wanted to do custom work. And I've said this many times. I am very blessed. I'm very lucky. The market that I work in, my ladies can afford the work. And so it's okay for me to take time on a quilt. Not every quilt. The first question I always ask is, what's this quilt going to be used for? And then the second one is, what's the budget for this project? And a lot of my ladies, can afford custom work and are excited to pay for it. So I keep a custom going all the time. Right now, my custom queue is out several months. So um, they just take a long time. And once you build that clientele that likes your work, that is excited by your work, they seem to come back. But those ladies also are bringing me edge to edge quilts while they're waiting for their masterpiece. They're still
Mhm.
making quilts for their grandkids and quilts for their quilt shops and quilts for everyday quilts, I call them. So
So, are there any particular tips or tricks that just kind of, um, for running the two machines simultaneously? You had mentioned sewing your backs together on your edge to edges, and what I'm envisioning then is you might have three edge to edge quilts that you're planning to do A, B, and C, and you'll just seam the bottom of the first one to the top of the second one, and then the
that's
bottom
right.
of the second one to the top of the third one, and then roll them all on
Yeah.
all at once.
The trick there is you want to measure from the center. So find your centers.
Hmm.
You start with your biggest one and you work your way down to the smallest back. That
Okay.
way they're easy it seems to keep the tension better that way as
Hmm.
you're building that big quilt. It's also, if I can talk my ladies, if they've got a baby quilt, sometimes they'll call and say, I'm making a baby quilt. And I'll say, why don't you make two? I'm sure you've got enough scraps to make another. Why don't you make another one and we'll put it on the same back, right? I've got a few sister teams who will make quilts together. I live on the far side of the county in New Jersey. A lot of my ladies live either in Manhattan or Brooklyn or really close to Manhattan. So they'll get a couple, three of them together and then bring me their quilts. And I'll say, why don't you get together and sew your backs together? Or maybe get together and pick out a great big 108 that you can all share. And that helps too. They're usually more than willing to do that if I knock a little off the bill at the end. And I always tell them it's going to help speed up production. They'll get their quilt faster, and it's true if they can do that for me. That's a big help.
And so having the two machines there, and a lot of the people watching may be interested in this. Are you normally like running, you've set up your edge to edge to run, and then you turn to the other table and just do some hand guided, or I mean, some custom while you're doing that?
That's usually how it goes. I do a lot of teaching, and so some days I'll come down and just run one machine. But on my studio days, when I call them my studio days, when I'm going to go downstairs and just quilt until I'm done for the day, on those days, I try to get down there early so that I can get all my prep done or do my prep the night before. That's even better. Another tip for loading all those big backs is I like a commercial wrinkle releaser. There's lots of brands. Mary
Hmm.
Ellen's Press makes one called I Hate Ironing that I really like.
Hmm.
There's lots of them available at the grocery store. Um, Lots of companies make them. And if I've got enough energy at the end of the day left, I will try to load at night, spritz my backs with that wrinkle releaser, and then I don't have so much pressing to do first thing in the morning. That solves most of that problem for me. Spritzing it. Some of the gamma educators talk about spritzing their backs with water before they load, and then in the night as they dry under tension, a lot of a lot of those wrinkles release naturally, and that saves some time. So if I can do it the night before, then when I come down in the morning to quilt for the day, uh, I think it's a lot more fun to just get started. Quilting
Hmm.
is probably my least favorite chore, and so I'll do anything I can to shave a few minutes off of it.
Hmm. So, this I feel like I might know the answer to this question because you had a Statler Ascend before, and that's why you got a second Statler Ascend. And so I'm not exactly sure how to put it, but there are a lot of machines available, not just the Statler. And being in the quilting industry for a while now, you've come across different machines that are out there. Um, is there did you ever have a moment when you considered one of the other machines as opposed to getting a second Statler?
Oh yeah, I had another machine for a minute. A friend of mine had a machine she was struggling with, and she had to make some money happen. And I was thinking about a second machine, so I got one. And it didn't last very long. It was supposed to speed up my process, and all it did was slow me down. It the little things that I took for granted on my Statler, accuracy, chief among them, speed. Um, One of the things that made me crazy was that you'd send a file to the stitcher to stitch in Gamma land, you say start quilting and it starts quilting. It's pretty straightforward. On a lot of the other machines, there's many clicks between when you're done designing and ready to start quilting. And if you screw up any of um, that chain of command, you've got to start over again. And that just made me crazy. And so I found that I was just wasting a lot of time um, on that kind of stuff, and also just on stitch quality, like consistent stitch quality. Um, the things that I know are true on my Statler weren't true on the other machine for some reason. I couldn't get consistent tension. I couldn't, that thing that you hear sometimes, my machine only likes this kind of thread. I never understood that because on my Statler, I could do all the threads. I could do anything my creativity drove it. The Statler didn't drive me, I drove it. And on these other machines, I would only use certain threads because I finally got it to work for two quilts. So don't change anything, right?
Hmm.
Which was really limiting.
Hmm.
So things like that. And, speed, accuracy,
Hmm.
all that stuff. It just wasn't the same.
Hmm.
So you really not just because you're on this podcast with us, you really find that your Gamel machines have had a better result for you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, I'm a teacher. I'm a quilt teacher. I teach in, people's homes and people come to me to learn. And some of them have long arms in their houses and I see what they're struggling with. And I didn't want to struggle that way. I didn't want to have those same struggles. Also, I'm a big guy. You can't tell on the podcast, but I'm 6'4", 300 pounds. I'm big. And so a lot of those little machines just felt, well, the word I use, little machines, right? They felt small, they felt unsubstantial. Certainly the tables felt like I was going to break them. Everything shook. They were loud. All of these little things sort of added up to the experience wasn't the same. And for me, as an artist, you sort of have to get in sync with your sewing machine. And I just couldn't get it anywhere. And what's funny, the first gamble I had tried all the machines at the shows because I was looking for a couple of years before I finally decided. And in trying all the machines, I just kept coming back to the Statler. And the dealer at the time, when they had dealers, um, she was very encouraging. And she said, I'm not even going to push it because I know you're going to keep coming back. And when it was time for me to buy one, I bought one. And when it was time to buy the second one, I bought a second one.
Mm-hmm. Well, you didn't though. You took a little detour.
Yeah,
You
I
thought,
did.
well, this other machine would be good enough.
I
So,
thought what I thought it would do, I thought it would speed me up and to help my friend out.
mhm,
And oh, all those other things don't, they're not so important. And I found out how wrong I was, right? I mean, I really found out how wrong I was. In that time when I started thinking about having a second machine, I'm sure a lot of folks think probably are the same boat as two machines sounds crazy. I mean, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of space, it's a big commitment to have two machines. I get it. But I knew the dollars and cents made sense. I needed to speed up, and I knew that my machine would pay for itself. My first machine doesn't owe me any money. Why would the second machine owe me any money? And but still getting over that fear of two huge machines, I thought, oh, the second one will be good enough. It'll be okay. And I'm telling you, it's cottage cheese and ice cream, man. Once you find the one you want, you just can't go
I
back.
remember that.
I've had people tell me that the Irish butter is significantly better than regular butter. And I've not tried the Irish butter for fear that I would have to spend the rest of my life with being a butter snob.
If I was in front of my refrigerator, I'd open it right now and show you all the Irish.
So we've got a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
I'll start with Deborah's first question. She's asked two now. I'll get to the other one. So her first question was if you quilt for quilters who are putting their quilts in shows.
I do. I do. I have a deal with my show quilters. Um, some show quilters want sort of all the glory and all the credit. And so, and that's fine. And so they pay one price, and that's we work together on a plan. But when the quilt leaves, it leaves. It leaves my life forever.
Hmm.
And then on some other show quilts that I do, they're more interested in a collaboration. And that's most of my show quilters. And so that's a different price. And we talk about if the quilt wins a prize for piecing, well, then that's yours. If it wins a prize for machine quilting, well, that's mine. If at the end of the day, if somebody wants to buy the quilt and there's profit involved, we work all that out going into it, especially for the big national shows. Now, most of my show quilters aren't putting them in big national shows. They're putting it in the local show at the church, or they're putting them in the county fair, right? So it's less of an issue.
Hmm.
But I do have some big quilters out there and that I quilt for, and we work all those details out ahead of time. It just my philosophy, my business philosophy has always been no surprises. If we can iron out all that stuff ahead of time, even if it sounds a little ridiculous, it saves a whole lot of heartache later.
Hmm.
And Deb is also asking, why would you recommend an Ascend over the Statler? She says, I've been debating with myself over upgrading. Tell us more why I should.
Sure. So the Ascend goes, the Statler is an awesome machine. I have to always start there.
It
Statler
is.
is awesome. I sewed on the Statler for a long time and I loved it. Couldn't tell me any different. And I was not convinced that the Ascend was what I needed. But my business was picking up and I thought, man, if it really does go faster, then I can do more quilts, right? And I really believed that the speed in edge to edge was going to be the big push for me. That's why I bought the first Ascend was for the speed. But I was wrong. Well, I was wrong and I wasn't. It does go faster, but it's more accurate at speed. And so things that used to take me a long time to do, like stitch in the ditch or click out a boundary, things like that, where I had to surf and go slow and be careful. if I had a real intricate pattern with lots of curves or something, I'd have to really slow down. On the Ascend, I could speed up. And so really, the edge to edge, yeah, sure, the edge to edge goes faster, but the custom work goes a lot faster. And that was fun. And so I knew if I was buying a machine to do custom work, that it had to have that accuracy because I just gotten used to it. The power assist on the Ascend is a totally different animal than it is on the Statler. It's much smoother. And so there are lots of times before when I would have to drop the belts that now I don't. I just turn my power assist on and go. And sometimes, you know, you think, well, that's only a few seconds to drop the belts. But if I'm doing a really complicated pattern where I'm using the Statler for part of the pattern and then hand guiding for the other part of the pattern, that on and off, those few seconds add up to minutes and hours over the course of the week. And so I found that I really loved not having to do that all the time. And that was great. Um, so that's why I got the Ascend, and that's why I love it so much. There's a story I tell often. I had quilted it was like a panel. It was a ladies' panel, and it was one of those not very expensive ones. Kind of, it was digitally printed, but not a good digitally printed one. You know, the kind where you punch a hole in it and you get the little white mark. Um, and I had forgotten to change the bottom bobbin thread. And so I stopped. I picked out, it was probably about 16, 17 inches worth of quilting.
Mm.
Got it all picked out, and I'm looking at all these holes thinking, I'm going to have to iron this when I'm done and close these holes and have to apologize to my customer and everything else. I put the right bobbin thread in and ran it again, and that Ascend quilted the design in the same holes, like exactly the same holes. There were no holes to close because it just quilted in the
Yeah.
same holes again. And I thought, okay, I got lucky once. That happened one time, I'm lucky. But it happened again. I was quilting, doing the same thing. And when I picked it all out, and this time it was a really complicated pattern. And same thing, stitched right back in the same holes. So stuff like that, that kind of accuracy, you don't find it on any other machine. And once you've had it, you got to have it.
Hard
Yeah.
to live without it.
The Ascend has beefier belts and motors that holds that accuracy
Yeah.
a lot stronger.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I've got a question here from Marlene, and I I struggled a little bit whether I would ask it or not because what she's asking is that she's curious what the brand was of that other machine that you had, and I thought, well, I didn't want to ask, and then I thought, well, it's part of the story, and
Yeah.
so
It was an Innova, a new one. Well, new to me, right? It wasn't one of the old classic ones. I think it was the newer model. Um, and it was the small Innova, their smallest one.
mm,
That's what I had.
mhm,
Again, I mean, I think if in the on the other side of that, maybe had I not known that it could be easy or it could be so much better, then maybe that would be okay.
mhm.
But I learned
Well,
on the Statler, and that's the language I speak.
there's an old saying that comparison is the thief of joy.
Totally.
And so you could have been very joyful, perhaps, with that other machine, but you were comparing it. And
Exactly. And there's a lot of other stuff we don't have to go into on the podcast, but I had to work with a dealer that we didn't have the best experience. I had to deal with their service that wasn't the best. And of course, I was spoiled by Gamble. I had a great dealer from Gamble. I had great service from Gamble. Bobby, was sick of hearing me call tech support, right? Because you call, somebody answers and talks you through the problem. I didn't have any of that with this machine. So even though I had a dealer, relatively closer than West Plains, Missouri, um, I wasn't getting anywhere near the same service that I got, from Gamble. So it's not just about the machine experience, it's the
mhm,
whole package.
Yes.
mhm. So, so now that we're in this new world where you've got the two machines,
Mhm.
I didn't think the story would go that much, but it was interesting. So I'm glad we dug into it.
I'm happy to tell
Um,
it.
So tell us about you have this thing called the Certificate of Authenticity. So what was your inspiration for this certificate, and what does it mean to your customers?
So I buy art. I buy art from galleries sometimes, or from art shows, or you know, from artists. And almost always it comes with a certificate of authenticity. It says this artist made this piece, and this is what it looks like. This is how many were made, and this is more or less what it would cost to replace it should you have a problem. Just documenting the piece of art.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, nobody's documenting my art. I think that I should start doing that for
Hmm.
myself anyway. So I started making them for my own pieces. And pretty soon, some of my customers are students, and they said, well, could you make one for me? And I started making them for them. And it was a good way for me to keep track of my customers and, what Martha put on that baby quilt 2 years ago, right? I've got just a copy of that certificate. But something happened unexpected, which was that they there's a real value for them. They feel very accomplished when you give them a certificate that they've finished this quilt and that it's art and that it has that kind of cultural value. And it's also nice because I include a material, labor, and quilting breakdown in the price and sort of this is what it would cost an estimate to replace it. And that's a really nice thing to if you're giving somebody a gift. It's sort of tacky to say, I spent $500 on fabric and $600 on quilting, so take care of this. But if you say, oh, here's your certificate that goes with it from the artist and from me, right, with some care instructions, I think it's much less likely to end up in the dog bed or,
Hmm.
on a shelf in the attic,
So is every quilt that you do now, you do a certificate of authenticity?
unless they don't want one. And most people want one. And once I realized how much it meant to my quilters, I dressed them up a little bit, put them on cardstock, put a seal on them, sign them. Um,
That is really neat.
and my customers love it. I've had some stories that there was a moving company that wrapped a piano in somebody's quilt and it destroyed it. And they used the certificate to make a claim and it paid out on the claim so she could make another quilt. I had a lady who had it and she
They
got,
use the certificate for a claim on the
yeah, they
quilt.
used the
Wow.
certificate for a claim on a quilt.
Its
Another
value is documented.
Yeah.
Exactly. Another lady had a problem with a shipping company, and the quilt got really damaged in shipping. And she had some insurance on it, but they were contesting the claim, and she had the certificate, and they ended up paying the whole amount. So it's a nice thing, and
Hmm.
it only takes me a few minutes. It's not very expensive to make, and my customers love it. I mean, and sometimes I've heard through the grapevine that sometimes if they've got a really special quilt, then somebody else's customer, right? Somebody else is doing all their edge to edge stuff, but they've got a really special one. They'll bring it to me, pay a little bit more so they get that certificate.
Mm,
So I think it's part of the market that I'm in, but also now that I've started it, I don't think my ladies will let me stop.
mm.
Ladies and gentlemen, I should say. I've got a few guys who I cook for too.
How do you do the calculation as to I mean, obviously the value of the quilting is whatever your bill was,
Sure.
but how do you do the calculation for the materials and labor?
So for the materials, I'm a piecer. I make quilts, so it's pretty
Hmm.
obvious for the most part. I can tell, this is quilt shop quality fabric, or that was two jelly rolls worth, or for the most part,
Hmm.
they're fairly similar in lots of those ways. And so, I trust my own experience, or I ask them, how much did you spend, at the quilt shop for this stuff, and they give you a ballpark figure. The labor is a little bit trickier.
That's what I was thinking. The labor's the hard part.
So
Hmm.
I know what I charge per hour to piece because I used to do it. And I also know in my area, there's a couple ladies who will make quilts for people on commission. And they're sort of in two groups. There's the sort of easy quilts, easier quilts. And then there's the more advanced or more difficult quilts. And so those are the two camps I use. Each one is the number that, those ladies would charge. And
Mhm.
I always round up a hair to make the math easy. And
Mhm.
that's what it is. It's not outrageous. I always think if somebody has to have this replaced and I have to make this again, what am I going to charge? And
Mhm.
that's how I sort of figure it out.
That's fantastic. I love that. I think a lot of people will be interested in that idea in their own market, especially because custom quilting is it's something that not every quilt deserves,
Right.
not every quilt gets, but sometimes a quilt is really special.
Mm.
So,
Yeah. I have
uh,
every quilt of mine goes home in a bag. I found a local place that sells these, they're breathable bags. And so in the bag's got the care instructions, the certificate, and then a little bag, a smaller bag inside that's got all the scraps and stuff in it. So that little bit of extra, which that sounds like a lot. I know that sounds like a lot of extra, but it doesn't cost me very much more. So I can charge slightly more than some of the other places in my market.
mhm, mhm.
So beyond the edge to edge and the custom quilting, what do you have any other services that you offer?
Yeah, I have a laser cutter, and so sometimes my anything I can do to help people keep quilting. And so sometimes that means I've got to cut a pattern for somebody. I've done that before. I don't always do it on my laser. Sometimes it's easier to cut it with a rotary cutter. But I have cut for people. I do bind, I've got some special binding tricks. I bind on my long arm. And so that's a no-brainer. That's a fast, easy way to have an upsell on just about every edge-to-edge quilt I do. They ask me to put the binding on for them.
Mhm.
And that's fast. That's probably my most profitable service that I do, even more profitable than the quilting because it goes so fast.
Mhm.
Um, if I can do it on the long arm, it's worth every penny. Um,
What's your per inch rate for applying the binding?
I'd have to look at my chart. I want to say it's 10 cents a linear inch, something like that. And then I charge them to make the binding a flat fee.
Hmm.
I also have a serger, and sometimes if they want it completely put on, so both sides of the binding, I don't do hand binding anymore. I just don't have time for it. But I will sew it on the back with uh, with my serger with fusible thread in the lower looper, and then I can iron it to the top, and then I fire it through my industrial machine, and I can do a pretty quick machine binding that way.
Hmm.
And so I'm still able to do that, and that one's more. I think that's 25 cents a linear inch. Um, but folks take me up on it all the time for binding. Another one that folks take me up on is I do two kinds of labels. I do one called an economy label, where you flip the batting up and you stitch on I'm sorry, you flip up the top and you stitch just on the batting and the backing.
Hmm.
You have to reverse it in CS.
Now you're using the text feature that's built
Using the
into
text
Creative
feature,
Studio.
yeah,
Okay.
built into Creative Studio, and I mirror it so I can, so it reads the right way on the back of the quilt. That's my economy label. And those are for grandmas who want, their name on it, but they don't want to spend a lot of money on a fancy label. And then I have an embroidery machine that I have set up for labels. And for my edge-to-edge quilts, that's an extra fee, and it depends on how big the label is. But for my custom quilts, every custom quilt that leaves my studio gets a label, and that's how I make sure that my name goes on it. It's free.
Gotcha.
It's a free label. Whether they sew it on or not is up to them, but it does leave the studio with a label ready to be sewn onto the back. And it
Mhm.
has, name of the quilt, and, well, whatever we decide together, but at the bottom, long arm quilted by me.
Right. So I'm a little bit confused, but I think you can clarify. I had understood that you had an all-in price, which I heard is being all-inclusive, but now we're talking about a lot of different extras.
Yeah.
So tell me about what's in the all-in price, and then obviously some of these other things are extra.
Sure. So some long armors will have a loading price or a thread price or a price per bobbin or a needle fee or a trim fee. So I say it's all in for me. It's um, the batting. We will it's 80/20 is what I quote. And if they want something different than that, then that number might change slightly, depending on if they want a real expensive batting or something. But most of the time I'm using 80/20. And so um, that's one variable in the all-in. But I don't charge a needle fee, I don't charge a trim fee, I don't charge, any of that stuff. Um, I started out with how much money I want to make per hour, and I work backwards from there. And then I figured out how much it would cost for needles and thread and all the things. And then that's how I set my prices per inch, per square inch, rather. And so at the end of the day, there's a quilting price, which has got all of those things in it. It's already got a trim in it. It's all got that. And then if they want something extra, like a label, or they want me to put the binding on, or something that's not sort of essential to the quilting, then that, that's extra.
Hmm. Gotcha.
Well, you've worked with non-traditional quilters like Girl Scout troops, senior centers, recreation departments.
You haven't
Can you
lived
talk
until you've
about,
had
tell us a little bit about that.
you haven't lived until you've had like a whole Boy Scout troop in your quilt studio. Um, I do a thing where there's a couple no-sew quilt block methods, mostly using fusibles or different kinds of adhesives. And I've been contracted half a dozen places, and then they've had me come back either annually or, when different folks come through their programs, and they'll make a quilt. And so everybody in the program might make a block, usually with fusible. And I take my scraps from my own piecing and from my own work, put fusible web on the back, and then sort of curate the colors so it makes sense based on a theme, whether that's the one I'm thinking of was fall leaves. We did one about leaves and trees at a senior center, and then we sit around the table. Everybody gets to, if you can wield scissors, then you can make a quilt block, and everybody cuts out their fusible prepped fabric. Say that three times fast, and build their quilt block. And then usually somebody in the group is well intentioned and will sew the blocks together for me. If not, I gotta sew 12 blocks together. These aren't real difficult pieces usually. And then I load it on my long arm and I do the applique on the long arm. So I'm doing applique and quilting at the same time. So it's like a one and done kind of procedure. And it's a lot of fun when you're done. You have something that looks like something. A lot of these like no-sew projects, they're not real great. These look like quilts because they're really nice quilts. And the organization can raffle it off, or the Girl Scouts can take it to the NICU to donate it. And so they have something, a real quilt that they can use, which is awesome. And
Hmm.
here's the best part. I'm using up stuff that would otherwise end up in the landfill, right? So there's not a lot of money spent on putting this together, and I'm charging for the quilting. I'm still getting paid, right? And
Nice.
all of that group, that whole group of moms and grandmas and dads, right? Oh, you know what? That was pretty cool. You know what? I think I could make a quilt. And so I've picked up a lot of customers from those kind of events.
Mm.
Um, and folks who do quilt, who show up to a quilt making event thinking it's going to be a traditional quilt making event and find it something totally different. They have a good time, and then I'm their new long armor. So that's been really good. And sometimes I don't charge the group, right? If it's a cause I really believe in, then and that's something I can do. I know sometimes as quilters we can get bogged down in charity quilts. And so this is a way for me to give back to the groups that I, believe in and care about and want to succeed, um, and not get bogged down in, miles and miles and miles of charity quilt work, which is important work, and I'm glad people are doing it. But that's just not where my business is right now. This is how I do the charity work by working with
Hmm.
those groups. And
Hmm.
those Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, I've had three of the kids become my customers, right? Or their parents, I guess, are my customers, but kids who really had fun and who really liked the procedure and
Hmm.
go home and do it for their birthday party. That was the one girl. Another kid liked it so well, he wanted to make a quilt for his teacher. And so he made his teacher a quilt and I long armed it for him. So it's just a different way of working, making your long
Hmm.
arm pay for itself.
Yeah. It also it makes really cool memories for those kids.
Oh
I
yeah.
It's interesting thinking about, when children start to quilt. Um, there's a lot of fascinating neuroscience, brain science about what happens to you when you engage in a creative pursuit that's so immersive, and the change in a child's brain, especially, will influence them for a lifetime in a positive way. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm just a fan. I've been very
He's not.
interested for years. Yep. I don't work on brains, but the way brains work, constantly rewiring themselves based on the challenges that you throw at them is nothing short of miraculous. And to see kids engaging in a pursuit like that, the world these days doesn't give them a lot of things like that.
Well, and not just kids, right? I mean, the elderly, right?
Yeah.
Folks who might spend a lot of time in front of the TV. Um, I teach a method, a piecing method. Well, it could be any creative method. I call it enlightened quilting. And it's just about what you're talking about, Andrew. It's sort of unlocking the power of our brains to feel better and quilt better and to have more fun doing it.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the lecture I give it at quilt guilds and stuff is well, someday the book will be completely finished and
Hmm.
everybody can learn. But it's
And
a
maybe I'll just show up at one of your lectures and
I
get it
would
for
love
free.
that.
Yeah, I'd like to
That's
go there.
actually why I started quilting. My advisor, my PhD advisor, said, you can't do my PhD is in theater, and she said you can't do theater anymore as a hobby. It's your job now, so take my advice and go find something totally unrelated. And for lots of reasons, I started quilting. And as I was sewing, the act of piecing the blocks, and then later on, free motion quilting was what did it for me. I started to solve a lot of problems in my brain, problems that like schoolwork problems, or how was I going to direct the next play, or man, I'm really struggling to communicate with my mom about something, right? All of that, my brain sort of found new ways of uh, of solving those problems when I was sewing. And so I kept sewing because it was like a superpower. I found if I could sew long enough and get into creative flow and find the zone, then I could figure stuff out. And I've decided that's what I was going to do with my life because it's great. It's fun.
So, so you touched on it briefly. You're highly educated. You've got that PhD in theater and education and a master's in fine arts. And so does that change how you approach quilting?
I think most creative projects, you know, my a lot of my quilting vocabulary comes from the theater. I think about my quilts. They have to tell a story, just like a play does. They've got design, just like a play does, right? The pieces have to, sometimes the pieces or the blocks are kind of like the characters in the story, right? I don't think I cognitively do that. Like I don't, make a chart or anything, but I certainly think about unity and those design ideas that I was taught and we practiced in the theater. I apply them to quilting every day. And something happens when you're an artist that muscle where you can see something and know if it's right or know if it's wrong or know if it needs just a little bit of another color or it needs more hard shapes or whatever, know that muscle that some people are born with and it's real sharp. I wasn't born with it, but I spent, like you say, a lot of time practicing it. And I was surprised to find when I was making quilts that that skill, I could apply it directly to quilt making. And it works. It works really well for me. Um, and I think that, one thing about the theater is that theater is a very expensive art form. You got to get a lot of people together. They've all got to eat. They've all got to be safe, right? You've got to rehearse a lot. They all need clothes to wear, and then all the things. You need a space. You need prop. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to making a play happen. And in quilting, there's a lot of pieces too, but I'm in charge, right? I can do them all by myself if I have to, but I don't have to do them all by myself. That's the other great thing about quilting is that you can invite the Girl Scouts over and make quilts, or you can, work on something. I love to quilt with my mom. And so it doesn't have to be a lonely art form, which was what I was worried about, and still apply all of that great design language and even the history, the art history that I learned in theater, I can apply to the quilts that I make. Especially if I'm looking at a traditional quilt, I can go, oh yeah, that reminds me of, and then that's how I come up with ideas for long arm patterns or regular piecing patterns, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm.
I think for me, they're one and the same. They all just kind of my theater friends think I'm nuts, right? Like you left, you did all this training and study, and they don't see the connection, of course.
Mm.
But to me, it's
Well, you've laid it out really well
yeah,
for us.
it's just
So,
the words change, but the ideas are very similar.
So, so tell us what when you went into quilting, you were drawn in by what probably the color and the beauty and the people and the artistic flow, and but really at this point, um, you know, it sounds like you're living a completely different life
Yeah.
than what you would have been living before.
It's true. I wish it were that romantic. I was cold and I was poor and I had a lot of clothes in the corner. And my mom said, why don't, instead of throwing those away, why don't you sew them together and make a quilt? And I said, it's a good idea. And then I found all the beauty and the flow and all this stuff, right?
the
And I,
necessity birthed the beauty.
it did. And I fought it for a while too, right? This is really fun. Oh no, I can't do that. I gotta stay doing this serious thing that I do, right? I'm not gonna become a quilter. Um, but when I switched over, I think having kind of goes back to that freedom of being able to take a day off when you need to go look for inspiration when you need um, to do those things. Has quilting has allowed for that. I'm an open book about my life for the most part, and I have a neurological problem that makes it hard for me there are days I just can't work, right? I just can't do it. Physically, I can't do it. And on those days, I don't. Maybe I read a quilt book or I look at other stuff, right? I
Mm,
can do other things. I can still work on my business without quilting. And that's awesome. That's very different if you're, the director of a Broadway play and you've got to stand up in front of, hundreds of actors and people and
mhm,
all their teams and make something happen. So quilting has offered me, like I said earlier, kind of another way to use those skills directly. And it's connected me with a whole new community. I didn't know these crazy people existed when I first started. Um, and, you know, I, the women, mostly women I work with are former CEOs, former teachers, former doctors, former engineers. Um, I've got bus drivers and moms. You've got the whole cross section of America, black and white and every other color that you could person can be. And in New Jersey, that's pretty normal, but it's not so normal to see everybody working on the same thing and passionate about the same thing. And that's exciting. Gives me hope.
Excellent. Well, Doc, it's been really great having you on here tonight, and we really appreciate it. For the people that are watching, is there any way they can see more of your stuff, or do you have a web site? Or, give us some information with that.
Sure. My personal website is Quilt Doc. Just quiltdoc.com. You'll find me. That's where you'll find mostly my business information, my rates, and some pictures of the stuff that I make. Some
Quilt
of the
Doc.
quilts, quiltdoc, yep, .com. And and then I teach for Gamble. So out on the road for tours and online video content and that kind of stuff. I teach for Gamble. Um, as long as they'll have me. I love teaching long arming. That's been sort of my newest venture is teaching how much I love my ascend to other people. So that's a lot of fun. They can find me, through those offerings on the Gamma Education portal. Um, and on Facebook. That's where most of my sort of day-to-day social media stuff happens. That's where I share pictures of what's under the needle today. When I've got time to do it, that's where it happens. Um, and that one is you'll find me just the Quilt Doc. Actually, it's Doc dash Andy. My given name is Andy, so Doc dash Andy. If you
Okay.
put that in there, you'll find me. There's only one Doc dash Andy out there in Facebook land, and that's how they can get me. And all my contact information's online.
Fantastic. And I wanted to mention too, if somebody has wants to pick up more of your story, when we interviewed you previously, that was our episode 6. And so on gamel.com/ quilting business success, they can look up episode 6, or they can go to YouTube and they're all there in order or whatever. So thank you, Doc, for sharing a little bit. It's interesting to me. I had thought going into this that I would know most of your answers to these questions because I do know you fairly well. And sure enough, you surprised me over and over again. So thank you very much
You're so
for.
welcome. I hope if anybody out there who's listening to this is thinking about starting a business with their long arm, I was just like you, just somebody who thought had a wild hair of an idea, and I always say it was the most reckless decision I ever made and the best decision, probably after getting married, my best decision.
Mhm,
And go for it because it's so much fun.
mhm.
Well, Andy Doc Wiginton, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. And
Anytime, guys. Bye
we will see you guys next time on Quilting Business Success. Thanks a lot.
bye.